Hi guys, this is going to be a step-by-step tutorial for doing the bubble stitch. This is using US terminology, and this little sample that we'll be working on, I'll show you how to do the normal bubble stitch here, the first two rows, but also ways to adapt it to create beautiful designs. So let's get started. So to make your bubble stitch, you will need your hook and a corresponding yarn, and we'll start as always with a loop on your hook and then a number of chains. Now, unless your pattern specifies something differently, or if you're working on your own, what you want to create is an even number of chains. So here I've chained 12 chains. And what we will do is, for the first row, we will do a simple row of single crochet stitches. And that, as normal, we will place our first single crochet stitch in the second chain from hook. And you should see that by the end of this row, we will have an odd number of single crochet stitches. There we go. We are about to single crochet into our last chain. So here we are. So here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So once you've reached the end of that first row of single crochet stitches, you will just chain one. And now we will start with our row of bubbles. And what's important is to remember that your bubbles will actually appear on this side. So you will not actually see the bubbles being made. They will be on the other side of your piece. So always remember, when creating the bubble stitch, that actually the good side is on this back side, not the one that you're looking at when you're making the bubble stitches. So to get started on this row, we will first do a single crochet stitch. There we go. And now we will do our bubble stitch. And this is essentially a series of semi-complete double crochet stitches. So what you do is you yarn over, just like you would do with your normal double crochet. Go through the stitch, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2 loops. And at this point, if you were doing a normal double crochet, you would yarn over and then you would pull through the last 2 loops. However, we won't do that. We'll leave that loop on our hook and we will just repeat this process. And you want to repeat it for a total of 5 times. So you want to create 5 of these semi-complete double crochets. So let's have a look again. Yarn over, go with your hook through that same stitch, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2. So you see here, you're putting all of these completed double crochet stitches into the same stitch. And the idea is that you essentially build up the volume and the volume of your bubble stitch, just to make it a bit more, add more sort of texture and structure to it. So let's do this once more. So here we have our original loop, and we've done it 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and we know we want to do it a total of 5 times. So there we are. So here you should have 6 loops on your hook. The first one is the loop that you had before, so that doesn't count. And so you know that the remaining 5 are the semi-complete double crochet stitches that you put into that same stitch to create your bubble stitch. Now, in most of the patterns that I use for my Etsy shop, I always specify how many times you need to repeat this process of semi-completing the double crochet stitches, mainly because a lot of the times you can put a few more in here and you have a much more pronounced sort of bubble, a bigger bubble, and then if you put fewer, you have a more sort of a less pronounced effect. So it does help sometimes with texture. But unless your pattern specifies otherwise, 5 semi-complete double crochets is what is considered the standard and what I see most patterns use. But again, your pattern should specify this, and that will make things a lot clearer for you. But once you've reached this point and you've essentially made sure that you've put enough semi-complete double crochets into your stitch, what you need to do is stretch this a bit, just to make sure that here on the front side, on what will be your good side, the yarn is lining up nicely. You don't want extra yarn to be caught here. You don't want it to be sagging. You want a nice smooth effect, and this is what we've got here. And if you're just starting with your bubble crochet stitches, you may want to do this while you create your completed double crochets. It will just make things a bit easier. But if you just tuck it at the end, that will be enough as well. So once you've done that, the last step is to really yarn over and then pull your hook through all of these loops. And do that slowly, don't go too fast, otherwise you might get caught in some of that yarn, and then it can become very messy very easily. But that's essentially the process, and you can see here our bubble stitch is being essentially created. Now, some people like to add an extra stitch here to secure your bubble stitch. I don't tend to do that, simply because I think this then adds a few extra chains in your piece that can be slightly confusing if you're just starting off. And I always secure my bubble by just going on the next stitch and doing a single crochet. And then I know, if I look kind of from the top of my piece, that I have my first single crochet here, my bubble stitch here, and then my next single crochet. And here is how your bubble appears on the other side. If you want to do a full row of bubble stitches, then you will just repeat this process in the next stitch. And that will look a bit like this. We've got 5, so we need 6 loops. And then you single crochet. And this is how your piece will look if you do a complete row of bubble stitches. However, what's really lovely about this pattern is that you can really adapt it, and you can play with the placement of these bubble stitches to create a different effect. So for example, you can have them divided by several single crochet stitches, or you can have them create a shape as you build up your rows. So it's a really beautiful design, because again, with a bubble stitch you can create so many beautiful patterns. So let us finish this so that I can show you how a completed row of bubbles looks like, and then I can show you some samples with how you can play around with this beautiful stitch that is one of my personal favorites. So here we are. I've gone through my entire row, my entire sort of chain here with all my stitches, and placed bubble stitches in between single crochet stitches. And now I'm left with my last 2 stitches for this row. The last one I've done is I've done a bubble and I've done a single crochet stitch to secure it, and now I'll do a last bubble stitch here. And then I'll be left with 1 stitch for this row. And that's why we needed the even number at the beginning, so that we always have that 1 remaining stitch that can be our single crochet stitch, in which we can rely on to anchor our bubble. So you will always start and you will always finish with a single crochet stitch, and in between you will have your bubble stitches, and themselves they will be separated by single crochet stitches. It's a very easy repeat for this row. Essentially, you start with a single crochet stitch, you place a bubble stitch, you do another single crochet stitch, a bubble stitch, and so on and so forth, and you always finish with a single crochet stitch. And then after you've chained 1, you can turn your piece around, and then you will need to place a series of single crochet stitches all across your piece, and then again after that you will be ready to place another row of bubble stitches. So very easy pattern to work on. You can also, like I said, play around with the placement of the bubbles, which means you can end up with some really beautiful designs very easily. So let us do another row so that I can show you how some of this works. And the important thing here is to remember if you are just starting with crochet, then I do recommend that you count your stitches on this row quite carefully. This is because you may not always see all of them, particularly if you've tried to anchor your bubble stitch quite strongly, which means that the single crochet stitches right after your bubble stitch might be a bit too small. So just to be on the safe side and to avoid disappointment at the end of your row, just make sure to count as you go along to make sure you don't miss any stitches. So this is my second single crochet stitch, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so I should have 11, and I do, so I'm good. I know I've got all my stitches, and that just means that you get, well, your piece remains the same size throughout, but you don't get your bubbles offset in a weird way. So now again, once you've done your row of single crochets, you can do another row of bubble stitches. So here you see I've worked up 4 rows of our bubble stitch here, and in this, for these rows I've essentially done the single crochet row stitch, I've done a bubble stitch row, and again we've started that off by doing a single crochet stitch, a bubble stitch, a single crochet stitch, and then a bubble stitch, and repeating that across the row, finishing up with a single crochet stitch. So you'll see here the entire row is full of bubbles, which is a really beautiful design. But the really great thing about the bubble stitch is that you can adapt or amend essentially where you place your bubbles while sticking to this rule that the first and the last stitch are always a single crochet stitch, and to create different designs. So for example, here I've spaced them out, and I've also offset them to create this kind of little zigzag pattern. So I hope you can see it a bit more clearly now. So the point is that you can play around with how many stitches you put in between your bubble rows. And you should always remember when you do that, that the row that you're meant to be doing your bubbles on, your bubbles will be looking away from you, just so that you don't end up with bubbles on both sides of your piece. But you can also play around with spacing them apart on the same row. So rather than doing bubbles throughout, you can just have a few single crochet stitches in between to create different designs. So it's really versatile if you think about it in this way. You don't always need to do the bubble stitch in this way. And the other great thing is that you can also play around with how many semi-complete double crochets you place in that single stitch. That will give you a more or less pronounced bubble in the end. So I hope that was useful, and happy crochet!